2024 is drawing to a close, and that means it's time to look back at all of the media I've experienced this year and rank everything. I already went through the best and worst films of the year, and now it's time for the games. I did a video game list last year, and just like that one, this isn't a rundown of games released in 2024 that I played. It's a rundown of games released at any time that I finished for the first time in 2024. Last year's list had 21 games on it, which was a pretty huge increase from the years before it. And this year I've again increased that number to a whopping 41 games. Some short and a couple extremely long. So long, in fact, that I had started them prior to 2024, but finally finished this year. The main reason for this big increase in video game playing is because I finally committed to making my own video game this year after being preoccupied with the idea for the past few years and slowly learning game design and researching different programs and game history and whatnot in my spare time. My partner Gray and I are making this game together as a two-person team, at least for the time being. We may or may not expand the team slightly over time. 2024 marks the official start of production, and we've already made a ton of good progress, but we know that it's going to be an extremely long process that'll take a few years as we both work on many other projects simultaneously. I might end up making a devlog sort of thing to track our progress on the game eventually, so I guess keep your eyes peeled for that, but that may or may not happen. When getting into making a game myself, I wanted a more thorough understanding of game design and game history, so along with doing tons of research on these subjects, I've also been making a concerted effort to play a much larger variety of games than I had in the past. And if you make it to the end of this video and still want more, I'm actually doing a second part of this video that will only be available to Patreon supporters. That bonus video will cover a bunch of games that I played, but didn't reach the end of and don't plan to. Games I've chosen to abandon unfinished. So check out the Brickwall Patreon if you're interested in that, and other bonus videos and early videos. But anyways, that's more than enough preamble. Here's everything I finished this year, ranked from worst to best. First up at number 41 is The Lighthouse Keeper, the worst thing I played this year. Basically a horror visual novel, except it doesn't come close to ever feeling like horror, and it doesn't tell any sort of cohesive story either. It's so short that I genuinely said, "Wait, really? That's it?" out loud when it finished. Even with a price tag of just 99 cents, I still can't say it's worth the money. This shit is genuinely embarrassing. It's like a middle schooler saw The Lighthouse and made a cringy and pretentious fanfic about it. The only entertainment value is that the narrator was kind of funny at certain points, but that was completely unintentional. Number 40, The Lancaster Leak, O'Brien State Park. Another embarrassingly bad, air quotes, horror game that had me saying, "Is that really it? It's already over?" when it ended after just a short few minutes. It purports to be a found footage styled game following an FBI investigation, but it half-asses the aesthetic and doesn't commit to its premise. It's basically a walking simulator where you're placed in a giant open forest, but that has invisible walls literally everywhere you go that even block off clear paths that seem like the obvious way to go. It's just terribly designed all around, and it's all in service of a couple of insultingly lazy jump scares with absolutely nothing happening in between. There are a couple of other Lancaster Leak games, but I will never be touching them. This shit sucked. Number 39, Grow Up, a sequel to Grow Home, a little climbing platformer that I thought was pretty fun, though perhaps too stripped back and small for its own good. Grow Up expands on the original, but not in the ways I was hoping for. The gameplay of this little duology is all about verticality as you climb up into outer space with your little robot. But rather than expanding the intricacy or level design of the sequel with verticality in mind, they expanded it horizontally instead, making a giant ground-level map that is tedious to explore and doesn't suit the concept or the mechanics of the game. Also, the robot felt a little loose to control in Grow Home, but in Grow Up, he feels downright terrible to maneuver around, which of course completely kills the enjoyment of a 3D platformer. Number 38, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. This is that new reboot version of it, where the titles are all confusing and don't make any sense. I skipped the Modern Warfare 2 remake or reboot or whatever you want to call it, and the first of the new trilogy is later on this very list. But this one is just bad and so lazy. They cut every corner that it is possible to cut, with about half or more of the campaign essentially being cordoned off sections of the Warzone multiplayer map that they dropped busywork objectives into when they were used. These openish areas come almost kind of close to providing interesting stealth options or exploration variety, but the team just didn't put in the work necessary for those things to work out. I only looked briefly at the multiplayer and was grossed out by how much it looked like Fortnite now with the Battle Pass, emotes, and stupid-looking skins and whatnot. No thanks. Number 37, Plague Inc. The original mode is free to play, and it's engaging enough for a run or two, but as soon as you figure out the ideal order to pick your upgrades in, the game basically plays itself and is a cakewalk. A bit too much of the potential gameplay is instead handled automatically, while you're left either just waiting or tapping on little pop-up bubbles like a generic mobile game. It's okay for what it is, but it gets old really fast, and it lacks the depth that this premise could have. Number 36, A Little to the Left. While it seems like a cozy game about organization from the outside, A Little to the Left is actually much more of a puzzle game, and as such, it's a mixed bag. A decent number of the puzzles are intuitive and relatively satisfying to put together, but far too many of them are obtuse as hell and require an overdose of moon logic to know what the devs want you to do. There are many frustrating puzzles where there are clearly multiple solutions that make an equal amount of sense, but only one solution is accounted for and accepted. The parameters for these puzzles are never clear enough, and it feels like the game wasn't play-tested, or at least not play-tested enough. I managed to finish the game without Googling any of the solutions, but there were definitely a handful of puzzles that I only solved by accident, including a few where I never understood how or why that answer was correct, even after staring at the completion screen for far too long. Number 35, Hellblade 2. It's a gorgeous-looking CGI movie with a pretty poor blockbuster storyline, and it's a shame about all that pesky gameplay getting in the way. There's such a gulf between how good this game is visually and how dull and uninspired the story it's telling is. And then another gulf between its narrative and its bolted-on gameplay that feels like such a slog to get through. The combat again looks impressive, but it isn't engaging to actually play in the slightest. It basically plays itself, especially once the game gives you that mirror ability that all but lets you skip most of the combat outright. The only other gameplay besides holding forward on the analog stick are the puzzle sections. But honestly, it feels like a stretch to really call them puzzles. It's truthfully just a lot of slowly jogging back and forth between different points without any thinking required. I guess a lot of people complained that the game was too short, but it felt like such a slog to get through to me with how tedious these puzzle sections were that I did not mind the short runtime. It felt a lot longer than it was. I wasn't a big fan of the first Hellblade either, which is a hotter take, I know, but this is definitely a step in the wrong direction regardless. Number 34, Call of Duty Modern Warfare. This is the first reboot, remake, whatever, of that newish trilogy, the new era. And it comes close to feeling like a breath of fresh air for the series, almost, but it ultimately still holds on to the past too much for it to be a complete restart. The slightly heavier, slower gameplay is welcomed, and certain missions like the much-praised night vision house-clearing one are distinctive and memorable, but a sizable chunk of the campaign is still just regular old disposable COD fodder. And the attempt at taking the story more seriously shows how seriously out of their depth the writing team is. It's okay for a single playthrough, no more, no less. But I have to dock it points for how unbelievably bad the whole setup and installation and navigation of the menus and all of that shit is. The modern era of Call of Duty with these humongous file sizes and the stupid hub that makes you look at content for all of the other games in the series, even if you don't own them. I hate that shit so much, and it's not a direction that we should collectively accept studios moving forward with in the modern age. As gamers, we need to collectively say, stop doing that. Number 33, Detective Grimoire. A charming little detective game that merges gameplay from the old school adventure genre with some micro puzzles and systems for presenting clues that do a little bit more to ensure you're really figuring things out than most detective games manage. Though I would have liked to have seen those ideas pushed significantly further, which I can really say about everything that's in here. My main issue with this game is just how short it is. I was baffled when the credits rolled because I 100% thought that this case in the swamp was just the easy tutorial case to warm up the player before getting into the real game. But no, that's the whole game. It turns out that the game is sometimes sold as Detective Grimoire Secrets of the Swamp, which definitely would have calibrated my expectations better, but the version I bought was just called Detective Grimoire, full stop. I was waiting for it to become more challenging and engaging, and it never did, which made it quite a disappointment. The mystery was too obvious from the get-go, without enough in the way of intrigue or red herrings to make unraveling it anything more than just a straightforward journey. There's enough here that I'm willing to give the sequel a try at some point, and I hope that that one delivers on what I was hoping for from this first game. Number 32, Toem. It's a cute little puzzle game where you go around taking pictures in a 2D, 3D space, but it doesn't do as much with that premise as you might hope. Everything's a bit too simple and easy, and it has that same problem that a lot of modern indie games I've played have, which is that everything and everyone is simply too friendly and happy, and your objectives don't matter at all, which means there's no conflict, and there are no stakes to anything you're doing. A game can be cutesy first and foremost, and still have stakes. Cutesy, cozy games like Animal Crossing and Harvest Moon still have stakes and conflict, and the bills that you need to pay and keeping yourself fed and whatnot. Whereas in a game like Toem, if you ask why you should bother doing any of this, you'll be met with a shrug. Number 31, Save Room. This is an organization puzzle game based on the attaché case inventory screen from Resident Evil 4, and it makes no attempt to hide that inspiration, for better or worse. It's a fun idea, but it doesn't fully deliver on the potential that's there. It has a couple of clever ideas, but the real letdown is just that its puzzles are all too simple, and there also aren't that many of them. I finished the game in about half an hour and only had to pause to think, maybe twice, with everything else being a little bit too obvious. If the puzzle designs were pushed further and the complexity ramped up, this could be really fun. Number 30, Beacon Patrol First Horizons. I played this during its free early access window, or at least I think it's early access. It isn't labeled as that on Steam, but there's a separate listing for Beacon Patrol with a 2025 release date, and there's also a board game version of Beacon Patrol, I guess. At any rate, it's an interesting little puzzle game that has a surprising amount of depth and strategy involved. It seems extremely limited at first, and the game does not do a good job of explaining itself to you. But you can learn and get good if you put in the effort. Unfortunately, there's not much incentive to put in that effort. Outside of the main gameplay loop, Beacon Patrol is as shallow as could be. It only has one mode, which is just an endless challenge, and it's impossible for it to not become repetitive extremely quickly, though I'll admit that it had its hooks in me for a couple of hours one night, even if I never felt compelled to return to it after that. Number 29, Beecarbonized. Another short and free game. This one looks like a deck builder, but it's actually more of a management game about combating global warming. It's a little confusing at first, but it's intuitive and engaging enough once you get the hang of it. It's also informative enough in an incidental way that science teachers could honestly have kids play this in schools. There are a handful of different win conditions, but after getting the global oasis outcome and defeating global warming on my second run, I figured there's no way I'm getting better than that, and concluded my time with it. Number 28, Venba. Mostly a narrative-driven visual novel type experience, but with simple cooking minigames to break things up. The storytelling suffers from a lack of subtlety, nuance, and subtext, with everything always being too obvious and on the nose for its own good. But there is still some poignancy to be found all the same, and it explores a perspective that I don't think I've ever seen realized in a video game before. You can finish it in one sitting if it looks interesting to you. Number 27, Babbdi. A bizarre and unique experience. The actual gameplay of Babbdi is nothing special. It's kind of a collect-a-thon type game where you can explore a city and pick up random objects, but you don't actually need to do even that much. The main path through the game only requires you to find your way to one location, go back to where you started, and then go back to that other location again and get on a train out of the city of Babbdi. That's it. It can be as short as a couple of minutes if you know where you're going. But what makes Babbdi memorable is just how weird everything feels. The people and places are all off-kilter and unsettling, and there's a lot to explore and find within the oppressive architecture of the city. Not just the literal collectibles, but little moments and visuals that jump out at you. It's an extremely weird game, and it's free, and you can finish it in a single setting. So I recommend that you try this out if this kind of thing interests you. Number 26, SteamWorld Quest. I became a fan of the SteamWorld series this year, and I played through a bunch of them. Quest is my least favorite so far, but I still enjoyed it. I love how much this team shakes up the gameplay and whatnot from one game to the next. It's extremely exciting and impressive. Quest is a fantasy deck-building adventure, and I love a good deck builder. While most modern deck builders seem to either be multiplayer-focused or are a roguelite or like experience, I appreciate Quest's decision to frame the game like an RPG with a curated single-player experience. There's a lot to like in SteamWorld Quest, but it sadly started to wear out its welcome by the end. The gameplay already gets repetitive on its own, And the issue is really not helped by the fact that you need to fight the same bosses over and over again. Plus, the card variety is a bit too limited, and the party options also feel more limited than they technically are, since some of the characters are just so much better than the others, and it doesn't feel like a real choice to choose between them. I hope SteamWorld Quest gets a direct sequel like Dig and Heist did to sand off its rough edges and make the concept really sing. I will definitely play SteamWorld Quest 2. Number 25, Last Seen Online. This is another free short horror game, but this one is actually good. It was made by a solo dev, and it does definitely feel small and a bit simplistic, but not in a way that hinders it. It really just adds to the vibe. There's a creepy atmosphere to the proceedings in the way that you navigate the virtual computer screen, plus some genuinely great and highly inventive puzzles. I played through this one with my partner, and it took both of us racking our brains to figure out these puzzles, and it was so satisfying to progress through each of the game's handful of stages to continue the story. It's quick, but it's a good time. Number 24, Inside. Inside is one of those creepy indie platformers where you play as a tiny, defenseless person making your way through a hostile world like Limbo or The Little Nightmares. I typically enjoy the vibe of these kinds of games at the start, but they don't always hold my interest long enough to reach the end. Inside kept me engaged right up until the ending, but then that actual ending itself didn't really stick the landing, and instead felt like it kind of just fizzled out, ending what was an otherwise enjoyable experience on a bit of a downer note. Still glad that I played through it, and I still recommend it for how tight everything preceding that ending is. Number 23, Glyphica Typing Survival. I'm a writer first and foremost, so a typing roguelite is right up my alley, and this delivers. It's slick and well-tuned even while still in early access. The visual style is perhaps a bit too minimalist, and even though that should help with clarity, there are times when it's impossible to read what you're meant to be typing because of all the chaos on the screen. Now, I will say that will definitely be a problem for some, but it actually feels like an effective part of the challenge to me. The gameplay is focused and fun, and it gets appropriately challenging deeper into the game. I have quite a high WPM, and have been known to take typing speed tests just for fun sometimes, but I still found myself appropriately challenged in some of those boss fights. And the game does include easier modes if you aren't a fast typer, but want to still experience the mechanics, or use the game as a way to improve your typing. It's not the most fully featured game at present, but I would recommend it at a sale price if it seems like your kind of thing, though I imagine it's more niche than a lot of the games on this list. Number 22, Bramble the Mountain King. This is one of those creepy indie platformers where you play as a tiny defenseless person making your way through a hostile world. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Bramble perhaps hasn't gotten the attention that other games of this ilk received, like Inside, but I think it outdoes them in a couple of key areas. Most importantly, in the variety department. Bramble holds true to the cores of the games that clearly served as inspiration for it, but it shakes things up from area to area in meaningful ways, and it even delivers multiple memorable and creative boss fights without ever getting much more complex on the gameplay side of things than holding a button or two. Great atmosphere, and it's effectively creepy when it counts as well. Number 21, The Forest. I enjoy the survival genre and its basic gameplay loop quite a lot, but most games in the genre don't provide enough of a hook to keep me engaged throughout, and tons of them don't have any sort of compelling end goal to work toward, which makes everything feel kind of pointless. The Forest provides both, while you're stranded in a hostile forest that is exciting and dangerous to explore. The way that endgame progression is tied to finding particular unique objects that are extremely easy to miss can be a little frustrating, but it also makes exploration feel incredibly rewarding. I just wish I wasn't left rechecking the same caves ad nauseum by the time there was a single tiny item that I needed to progress hidden somewhere on the gigantic map like a needle in a haystack. Not sure what the best solution to that would be, as I do applaud the lack of objective indicators and whatnot. I'll avoid spoilers, but I will say that the last act of the game is the kind of thing that is extremely cool at first, but works better if it's kept brief, and they didn't do that. It wore out its welcome a little bit here. The final boss fight was also quite frustrating without being rewarding to finally beat, and the story wrap-up at the end was almost comically drawn out, with ending after ending going on and on long after the intrigue was gone. But for the most part, I loved my time with The Forest, and I was really impressed by the enemy AI especially, and how the game merged scripted encounters, a reactive world, and emergent gameplay together to create a constant sense of escalating danger and keep the combat feeling fresh. Anytime I started to feel like I had seen all of the enemy types or behaviors, the game would either throw something new at me, or the enemy would start behaving in crazy new ways. I was excited to jump into the sequel, but I haven't been able to get it running properly on my computer or on a Steam Deck, even now that it's out of early access, so I'm out of luck there, I guess, for the time being. Number 20, SteamWorld Dig. This was where my exploration of the SteamWorld franchise began, and with how much I enjoyed it, I would not have expected the results to mostly go up from here. SteamWorld Dig absolutely nails a satisfying gameplay loop with a great sense of progression as you earn more money and buy upgrades to keep digging deeper and deeper. I played through most of this in one sitting, but it felt like a great length. The only thing that let me down a bit was the ending boss fight, which felt not just frustrating to complete, but also pretty out of place, like the devs threw in a boss fight finale just at the last minute because it seemed like there needed to be one. All in all, it won't blow your mind, but it's very satisfying and a lot of fun. Number 19, Balatro. It's true what they say about Balatro. This game is seriously addicting. As an avid real-life poker player, Balatro was extra up my alley. There's a ton of mechanical depth here, and I think it's safe to say that this is the card game that hooked me the most since Slay the Spire, which says a lot. Number 18, SteamWorld Heist. I'm currently playing through the recently released SteamWorld Heist 2, but I won't be finishing that by the end of the year. So you can expect to see me cover that one next year, assuming I do another installment of this list. SteamWorld Heist is such a fun time. It's a strategy game that packs a surprising amount of tactical depth into its 2D presentation. There's a ton of variety to the different characters and loadouts, although they admittedly don't feel particularly well balanced, similar to that issue in SteamWorld Quest. But even if you mostly stick to the same team of characters, it's fun to experiment with their different loadouts, and the game gets pretty challenging by the end without ever feeling unfair or overly punishing. Overall, Heist feels really tight and polished, and it's a great time. Number 17, SteamWorld Dig 2. The last SteamWorld game on this year's list, though I'm currently playing Heist 2 as I mentioned, and I do plan to play SteamWorld Build at some point as well. Dig 2 is a great example of how to make a sequel. It's that kind of across-the-board incremental improvement on everything that the first Dig already did well, and it's a remedy to its shortcomings, i.e. they figured out how to make boss fights fun in this one. The world is much more segmented into levels and sub-areas in the previous game, which could sound like a negative, but it actually enables tighter level design and a greater emphasis on platforming, which is all well done. Really impressive stuff from the team. Highly recommended, but definitely start with the first game. Number 16, Fallout New Vegas Old World Blues. I'm a massive fan of Fallout New Vegas. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I've played through it more times than I can count, but I had never actually played any of the DLC until this year. There was a time when I had kind of wrongly written off all DLC as lazy cash grabs in the way that a lot of it really is. Just, cosmetics or chunks of what should be in the main game lopped off and charged extra for. But I've come to realize, far too late, I will admit, that there are plenty of genuinely high-quality, high-effort DLCs out there from studios that care and maintain a high bar for quality. And Obsidian is definitely one of those studios. Old World Blues might have been my least favorite of the 4 big New Vegas DLCs, but I enjoyed all of them. This one is more comedy-minded than the others or the base game, and the writing is often witty, but it is frequently hampered by the long pauses that the game engine leaves between each line of dialogue. It's clear that it's meant to be spoken as rapid-fire back-and-forth banter, but the game engine just doesn't present it that way, and it kills the pacing. There's a big hub world to explore, but it's a bit bland and samey from place to place, though there are a couple of standout locations with some cool environmental storytelling and some fun, unique weapons to be found. Plus, the storyline connects to the main game and the other DLCs in interesting ways. And up next at number 15 is Fallout New Vegas Honest Hearts. Honest Hearts lands pretty closely to Old World Blues when ranking the New Vegas DLCs for me. This one uses environmental elements like water and verticality in ways that the base game never explored, and the new hub world is a good size, even though it's a little more empty feeling than it perhaps could be. On the narrative side, this DLC has one fascinating character and sets up a pretty intense and interesting core conflict, but the writing is just a little too in the background for how compelling the ideas are. And unfortunately, the tribal stuff comes off a little bit uncomfortably, and it also just doesn't really make much sense in universe if you stop to think about it. Number 14, Condemned Criminal Origins. I've played through the sequel, Condemned Bloodshot, a whole bunch of times in the past. It's something of a Halloween season staple for me, but I had never had the chance to play the original until now. Despite ranking the game this high on the list, I do have to say that the narrative side of this game is absolute garbage. The story is cheesy as hell and ridiculous, and the voice acting, especially from the player character, is just awful. However, That stuff doesn't get in the way much, hardly at all, which feels crazy to say. The story is just a linking spine that shuttles you from one creepy, rundown, gross location to the next. And the horror and gameplay elements are where this game really shines. The scares are exceptionally well done, and the environments are extremely well designed and always creepy. The animations for the enemies are weird and creepy too, and the combat is simple, but it's fun and punchy. These devs also made the OG Fear games, and they are so good at building atmosphere and constructing scares, constantly misdirecting your attention to catch you off guard, and also constructing locations that always open up in multiple directions and loop back around on themselves, so that the enemies can always believably sneak up on you. The strength of the horror easily overcomes the weakness of the narrative. Number 13, Hades. I've played a ton of roguelikes and roguelites, but I'm not the biggest fan of the genre. I am one that's done exceptionally well, but they often aren't. It's a genre that can usually be repetitive by design, and I often lose interest in them pretty quickly, but Hades is one major exception, owing to the strength of its writing and character work. In most roguelites, dying feels like a frustrating loss of momentum, but in Hades, as plenty of others have taken note of, it's a way to continue pushing the story forward and keeping you engaged with its ensemble cast of charming side characters. The amount that everybody has to say is also just truly impressive. I never heard a line of dialogue repeat through my entire playthrough, and I'm sure that there's still a lot more dialogue to uncover in the end game content, which I didn't dive too deep into. Oh, and the gameplay is solid. The weapons all feel good to control, there's a good escalation of challenge that always feels fair, and it's really finely tuned. The sequel came out this year, and I'm not jumping straight into it, but I do plan to check it out eventually. Number 12, Alan Wake 2. I've been glad to see Alan Wake 2 get such overwhelming acclaim. I don't unequivocally love it across the board like many do, but I do agree that it's a special game and a tremendous work that serves as a culmination of so much lore and so many years of work from Remedy. I found its gameplay a bit too frustrating at points, and its writing lacking just a bit in certain areas to give it full marks, but I found the atmosphere and style side of things to be absolutely perfect. Even with some things that hold it back a bit for me, we need more games like this. Number 11, Cocoon. This is such a tight and polished puzzle game that is singularly focused on its brilliant core premise. Everything is slick and intuitive without the need for any UI, tutorial prompts, or any text or dialogue whatsoever throughout the entire game. And the puzzles had the perfect level of complexity in my eyes to be challenging and satisfying to overcome without ever being obtuse or frustrating. Everything feels so perfectly dialed in, and Cocoon really excels at precisely what it's going for. And we're finally into the top 10. Number 10 is Still Wakes the Deep. This one seemed to fly a bit under the radar, but I highly recommend Still Wakes the Deep to horror fans. It takes place on a Scottish oil rig in the 70s where Lovecraftian horrors emerge from below the ocean, which is such a great setting for a horror game, and they get the absolute most mileage possible out of it. The gameplay is simple and it takes a non-combat approach, similar to other horror titles like the Outlast games or the older Amnesia games. It's nearly a walking sim, but there's just enough complexity to the navigation to keep things more engaging, plus a couple of effective chase and stealth sequences to break things up. It's in the horror and the narrative that this game really shines. The voice cast all turn in solid performances, and the player character is especially great. He really sells the terror of the situation and the devastation of losing friends in the chaos. And it luckily doesn't outstay its welcome either. I found that the non-combat horror game approach tends to work better in short bursts, lest they become more exhausting than thrilling, and Still Wakes the Deep felt like the perfect length. Number 9 is New Vegas Lonesome Road. Lonesome Road was the last of the Fallout New Vegas DLCs to be released, and you can tell that just by playing it. It feels like a culmination of the base game and the preceding DLCs in the way that it weaves its themes together. It does have some pretty significant drawbacks, namely a lack of NPCs to interact with and an over-reliance on combat, which is definitely not where New Vegas shines, at least not usually. But it feels like such a complete and essential experience in the New Vegas canon. And even the combat does feel more fun and exciting than usual, owing to an extra emphasis being placed on the level design and the specific crafting of the enemy encounters. Lonesome Road is by far the most linear of the New Vegas DLCs, which sounds like a bad thing, but it actually helps it feel like a distinct experience. One that was built with the express intention of being a fun first-person shooter, rather than being an RPG with first-person shooting included. If you hate New Vegas' combat, you won't like this DLC. But if you think it's even just pretty good, Lonesome Road shows the potential of its various combat systems by throwing tough enemies at you in interesting combinations and locations, really testing your skills and equipment and forcing you to vary up your approach to each encounter far more than you normally need to. Plus, the choice that you're given at the end of this DLC is a huge one that has ripples on the base game that you return to afterward, which is super cool, and it even potentially gives you a couple of new areas to explore depending on the decision that you make. Number 8. Frostpunk on the Edge. In addition to going through all of the New Vegas DLC this year, I also went through all of the Frostpunk DLC in preparation for both my Frostpunk video essay and the release of Frostpunk 2. This one ups the difficulty from the base game by drastically limiting your available resources, even more than they already were limited in the base game, by placing your city at the edge of a cliff where nothing grows and you have less room to expand. It also introduces other settlements that you must establish relations and trade with in order to overcome the lack of resources close to home, which entails frequent trade-offs and some light diplomacy management, though it doesn't get anywhere near as complicated as the diplomacy that you would find in the 4X genre, or the grand strategy genre. On the Edge is a fun challenge, though I did find that the difficulty peaked early on, while the climax was pretty easy, unlike the nail-biting finale of the main scenario. And speaking of 4X, number 7 is Civilization 6. I returned to the Civilization series this year for the first time since I was in middle school playing Civ 3, and not really knowing what I was doing back then. Technically, I had briefly dabbled in the console ports of a couple of different Civ games, but found them too unintuitive to handle with a controller to get sucked into. But when I went back to the PC version, boy did I get sucked in hard. All the 4X jokes about getting addicted to them and the whole just one more turn thing, they're fully deserved. I played through a couple of full campaigns with different cultures going for different win conditions, both with the vanilla base game and then again with the major DLC packs added. And since Civ has tremendous replay value, this is what I'm still going back to. My rediscovery of Civ 6 led to me trying out a bunch of other 4X games this year, but I didn't put enough time into any of those to really consider them completed, which can already be hard to define in this genre, so you might have to check in next year for more 4X thoughts. Number 6 is Frostpunk: The Fall of Winterhome. This is another of Frostpunk's alternative scenarios outside of the main campaign. This one was a free DLC, so you might not have even known it was DLC. And this one takes the form of a prequel, or almost a sort of sidequel, at the Winterhome settlement, which you can find the destroyed remnants of in the main campaign. It's a cool idea for a separate scenario, and they were able to avoid it ending in just an inevitable collapse without feeling like they were undoing or rewriting what was shown in the main storyline. Pretty clever stuff. The Fall of Winterhome might have actually been the most challenging of all the Frostpunk DLCs and scenarios. This one took me quite a few attempts to get right, and it was extremely satisfying to finally overcome the challenge, even if it's quite a bit simpler mechanically than the other two Frostpunk scenarios on the list. It doesn't bring quite as much to the table. Number 5. New Vegas Dead Money. Dead Money seems to be something of a divisive DLC amongst New Vegas fans, but it was my favorite of the bunch by quite some bit. I've seen lots of people describe it as a survival horror DLC, and if that's really what the devs were going for, then I don't think they quite nailed it. However, I enjoyed it first and foremost for the flexibility of its level and mission design. There are 2 large, semi-open, semi-interlocking areas that you progress through in Dead Money, and they're both extremely different and provide you with a ton of options in terms of how you accomplish your goals and in what order. This is the most that New Vegas has ever felt like an immersive sim, even though it still doesn't really go all the way in that department. The writing is so sharp and clever in this one too, with by far the best companions of any of the DLCs. All 3 of them are extremely interesting, and they shake up the gameplay in meaningful ways with their unique perks, which can't be said of the companions in Lonesome Road or Honest Hearts. The new enemy types introduced are good threats that force you to vary up your playstyle in interesting ways, and the level design is just so good here. These places are incredibly hostile, but so much fun and so intuitive to explore. Dead Money has the best writing and the most interesting gameplay. It's an easy choice for me for the best DLC of the bunch. Number 4, Frostpunk Last Autumn. The Last Autumn is the Frostpunk DLC that shakes up the base game the most. In fact, it's such a departure that it practically felt like a smaller Frostpunk 2 before the real Frostpunk 2 actually came out. Side note, I did grab Frostpunk 2 as soon as it came out, but I haven't put much time into it to properly evaluate it yet, so look to next year's list for those thoughts. The Last Autumn is a prequel that goes back much farther than the Fall of Winterhome did, to before the big storm altogether. In the last autumn, the storm is a looming threat on the horizon, and you're now overseeing the construction of one of the first generators, which is such a fun and clever way to approach DLC in this world. Since it's before the storm, temperature is basically a non-issue in this scenario, which means that the main gameplay mechanic of the base game is all but done away with. That sounds like it could be disastrous, but the absence of pressure from that one mechanic is replaced with multiple all-new mechanics and many different new buildings to control, meters to manage, and factors to consider, like the loyalty of your workers and how superstitious they are and whatnot. It's extremely cool and fully fledged. If there's one downside, it's that it seemed a bit easy to me compared to both the base game and the other scenarios, but it's possible that that's maybe just a byproduct of me playing so much Frostpunk this year, and a sign that I should replay it on the hardest difficulty settings. Number 3, Persona 5 Royal. I mentioned this one in last year's video, I believe, as a game that I put a ton of hours into in 2023, but hadn't finished yet. Well now, despite them taking the game off of Game Pass and needing to purchase my own copy, I have finally finished Persona 5 Royal. And even though the last act was actually a bit of a letdown that got too huge for its own good to me, I still absolutely loved my time with the game overall. Surprisingly, I was actually never really sold on its turn-based combat, and found it to be a little tedious once the flashy luster wore off, but I loved these characters and the story and the social sim side of things more than enough to make up for it, and then some. I played a bit of Persona 3 Reload remake thingy after this, but that one didn't quite suck me in. Maybe I'll return to it at some point. Number 2, Disco Elysium. I finally finished Disco Elysium this year. It was a game that I really took my time with because I simply did not want it to end, and I didn't want to rush through it. It's a game that deserves to be savored, and it really is just one of the best goddamn pieces of writing ever released in any medium, let alone video games. It's a shame how the studio and team behind it imploded so thoroughly in the aftermath of this success, because we desperately need more games like it. And number 1, the single best game that I finished in 2024 was Baldur's Gate 3. Yes, I agree with all of the awards and accolades that this game has gotten. They're all fully justified and deserved. I was entranced and amazed by this game throughout all 130-ish hours it took me to finish, and I plan on going through a second playthrough in the not-too-distant future, because there's obviously still so much more in here to experience with the various character builds and items that allow for near unparalleled freedom and exploration in combat. This is a true masterwork, and I cannot wait for what Larian makes next, and I'll also be diving into the Divinity Original Sin games post-haste. Thanks for watching, and a quick reminder that you can become a member of the Brickwall Patreon to get access to that patron-exclusive bonus video, where I'm going to go through a bunch of extra video games that I tried but jumped ship on before reaching the end. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next year.